This dusty old thing is my launch model PlayStation 3. It got the yellow light of death. It's a shame because this is one of my favorite consoles of all time because it was back when Sony cared about backwards compatibility, allowing for 3 generations of PlayStations in one box. I eventually replaced it with a Generation 2 fat model, which is not as cool because it lacks hardware-based PlayStation 2 emulation. But hey, at least I had software-based emulation and I could go to the PlayStation Store and select from over 300 PlayStation 2 games to download and play, which is a lot more than Sony's current offerings. I think the PlayStation Fat is the best looking model out of all the PS3s released. My only issue with it is that it draws a lot more power than the Slim lines, and it gets really loud when you play for a long time. I eventually purchased a PlayStation 3 Slim secondhand in order to test out custom firmware on it, and it looks terrible standing up. One final model of PlayStation 3 was released, the Super Slim. This model only came with 12 gigabytes of internal flash memory, primarily because it was advertised as a media machine to play Netflix on. It released in late 2012 and just months away from the launch of the PlayStation 4, so this thing was kinda off my radar. Recently, I got back into PlayStation 3 collecting, so I went to the internet's trap house, OfferUp, hoping I could score a PlayStation 3 Super Slim on the cheap. I saw these 2 photos that a crack dealer posted on OfferUp, and I knew this was the console for me. But 12 gigabytes is not gonna cut it for my needs, so I decided to upgrade the hard drive to a 480 gigabyte solid state drive. It's really easy to upgrade. All you gotta do is remove this side panel and pull out the hard drive caddy. Oh, where is it? I guess my crack model didn't include one. That's okay, I'll just make my own. For this DIY mod, you're just gonna need a flap of cardboard and an X-Acto blade. Just cut out a rectangle of cardboard that's a little smaller than your solid state hard drive and jam them both into your secret drug stash bay until they fit snugly. Now let's fire it up and test out the blazing speeds of our new solid state. Okay, first thing to note, if you are installing a game from the game disc itself, it does not matter your model of PS3 or the speed of your hard drive, they will install at the exact same rate and finish installation at the exact same time. In this scenario, the bottleneck for speed is the Blu-ray drive. Let's take a look at installing packages that you would get from the PlayStation Store. I'm installing Lone Survivor on both my Super Slim with the solid state and my PS3 Fat using a 7200 RPM drive. You'll notice that the solid state installed the package within 26 seconds, whereas the hard drive took 29 seconds. 3 seconds of difference isn't exactly life-changing. Let's take a look at one final scenario. The grand majority of PlayStation 3 games require the user to install the game to the PlayStation's hard drive before play can begin. The game disc in this scenario would only be used for authentication purposes to validate the game license, meaning that the assets are loaded directly from the hard drive and not from the disc during gameplay. Yakuza Dead Souls is one of those cases, so let's take a look and see what's improved. Loading up the game world of Kamurocho takes the solid state around 12 seconds, whereas it takes the hard drive exactly 18. Let's try this one more time. When leaving this Kobeni here, it takes the solid state almost 13 seconds, and the hard drive almost 19. A savings of 6 seconds might not be a lot to some people, but added up over time, it may be significant. So is there any added benefit to putting a solid state hard drive in your PlayStation 3 Super Slim? Well, nothing performance-wise, but it did make my PS3 Super Slim quiet as a mouse. Let's compare. Alright, I can't wait to show off some of these games, and this doesn't look good. This is Sony's Dualshock 3 controller, and the worst one they've ever made. Case in point, I'm just gonna set this down and... let's compare it to the Dualshock 4. Ah, much better. Good luck trying to find an authentic Dualshock 3 because there's now hundreds of clones flooding the market. Thankfully, most of them are easy to spot. Telltale signs are that P3 button in place of the home, but then there are some clever deceptions, like this one I found on eBay that includes the home button. But if you click over to the next image, not only is it missing the home button, but this scammer was so lazy they didn't even bother to Photoshop the controller in the hands. It's just resting on top of the thumbs. In my research, I did find a solution to all of my problems with the DualShock 3 in one fell swoop. In comes the Cronus Max Pro. This little guy allows you to remap the PlayStation 4 controller to the DualShock 3 standard, and even allows for 6-axis controls. You just plug it into your PC, set the output to PS3, and then you can plug it into your PS3, and then you have a couple of options. You can plug in your DualShock 4's charging cable and play it in wired mode, or you can plug in a Bluetooth adapter. I'm using the BT400 by Asus here, and play wirelessly with minimal lag and all the features. This upgrade alone helped my PlayStation 3 feel a bit more welcome in the modern era, and I went back and rediscovered some old favorites with better controls. Allow me to clarify this matter even further. I had some commenters in my last video mention that you can pair a DualShock 4 to a PS3 via Bluetooth, and while that is technically true, it will be missing half of the features. The big one is you can't use the home button when it's paired via Bluetooth, but the Cronus allows for the home button, as well as 6-axis motion control, which some early games require to be playable. The Cronus restores that, as well as vibration. So if you want all the features of the DualShock 3, you're gonna need a Cronus, or I have one more solution. Back during the spring, I went over to Osaka, Japan, and I went to a secondhand game store, and I was on the lookout for an authentic DualShock 3, and I spent 3,000 yen, and I got a Japanese DualShock 3, and it's completely compatible and has all the features of the original. So that's another solution. Just buy an expensive ticket to Japan, and go to a secondhand game store, and there you go. Get a cool stand and impress your friends. Remember how I said the PlayStation 2 Slim looked ugly standing up? Well, the Vault aimed to fix that. In anticipation of everyone's most favorite entry in the Mass Effect trilogy, Caliber released about 10,000 of these things and put them out in the market until they sat on a shelf and no one bought them. Until a decade later when I did. This is a 3D armored case which keeps your PS3 Slim protected from Krogans and looking uncool. Some assembly is required, and you're gonna need a Phillips head screwdriver to finish the job. This new old stock has been lying around for a decade, so the adhesive on the front emblem was no longer sticking, so I had to find some Gorilla Glue and a brick to hold it in place while the glue cured. That's better. Lifting up the chest plate reveals the batteries, which the big brains at Caliber packed inside the bay where they corroded over the 10 years. I had to clean this out with some vinegar and a toothbrush. I popped in some new batteries and the N7 logo lit up. Nice. Here it looks lit up in the dark, and no, that's not my white balance acting up. The stand actually came with the blue ending. Oh, and I should mention there's a nifty controller holder on the back. Take your PS3 to the next dimension. The third one, in fact, with the PlayStation 3D monitor, and sometimes I call it the PlayStation TV. I bought this on clearance for $50 about 10 years ago, and I've been using it as a second editing monitor. But you can also enjoy 3D movies and games using these kind of uncomfortable glasses. The PlayStation 3D display is quite an impressive monitor. It's a 24-inch LED display that has a 240 Hz refresh rate. It's not too shabby if you're looking to play modern games on it as well. On some PlayStation 3 games, it's proudly displayed as a 3D compatible game. So I decided to test out Sonic Generations because I thought it would give me a better perspective on both the 2D depth of field and a 3D environment as well. On the 2D Sonic levels, the parallax scrolling in the background looks infinitely more impressive. And flying through the 3D levels, it gave me a new appreciation for the 3D Sonic games. There was something exhilarating about using the spin dash attack and going through all the loop-de-loops, and I didn't get motion sick like I would with the PSVR. There are a lot of 3D compatible PS3 games, some of which will surprise you. The 3D monitor comes with my highest recommendation. Get yourself a PlayStation Eye and you too can become the most documented human of all time.
Get that stuff off of there. Off of there fast.
I'm working on it.
This little 640 by 480 webcam was responsible for building the platform of YouTube.com. It also allowed you to play some PlayStation Eye exclusive video games, which were mostly art showcases where you just waved your arms around wildly and accomplished very little. And it also acts as a microphone and video capture device for online multiplayer. I ran into an issue with my PlayStation Eye. It's just a chunky boy and it doesn't sit well on most modern flat panel displays. So I went on Amazon and I bought a clip for it. Ah, that's much better. Now I can go on with my YouTube career. As the saying goes, for every Nintendo action, there's an equal and opposite Sony reaction. Let me introduce you to the PlayStation Move and Navigation Wand. This was a direct response to the smash hit known as the Wiimote, and Sony began to introduce motion controls to their more popular titles and built some games around the gimmicks. I hate to admit this, but I bought a PlayStation Move at launch so I could try out the augmented reality sensation known as iPet. It was quite a creepy and not fun experience and one of my life's greatest shames. The PlayStation Move really excels in the places you think it would, primarily in the areas of first-person shooters. You can identify games that have PlayStation Move compatibility by looking on the cover where it's advertised or on the spine where it has a special mark indicating it's Move compatible. I wouldn't say there's one particular killer app for the PlayStation Move, but even if you have a slight interest in VR, I would recommend getting one of these because it is forwards compatible with the PSVR on the PS4 and PlayStation 5. In my opinion, it's just another annoying thing to charge, and I'd rather just play with the DualShock 3 when given an option. I recently discovered that Sony officially released a PlayStation memory card adapter. This allows you to back up your PlayStation 1 and PS2 memory cards as digital memory cards, which you can then use on PlayStation 1 and 2 software on your PS3. I should also point out that all models of PlayStation 3s are capable of playing PS1 discs. However, only launch models of the PlayStation 3 FATs are able to play PS2 discs. But if you have a hacked PlayStation 3, then you can actually rip PS2 games directly to your hard drive and play them via software emulation. Your mileage may vary when it comes to software compatibility, but you can check the compatibility list online before you get too deep into this. And I desperately miss the era when backwards compatibility was at the forefront of console development. A while back, I did a series of investigative videos into the hardware problem known as the CBOMB, which affects 100% of PS3s. It hasn't been patched out by Sony, and I felt I should allow you all to know this exists before I recommend any digital games out there. Please go check out those videos. I'll include the playlist to kind of explain in more detail. But essentially, there's a watch battery called the CMOS battery inside of every PS3 that eventually goes bad. So, in order to unlock your digital game library, your PS3 has to call out to Sony's time servers, essentially, to get the correct time, which validates all the licenses on your PS3 and unlocks your game. So it's not a matter of just simply replacing the battery. That call has to be made eventually to unlock your games. So, to bypass this, there's a few different measures. You can just hack your PS3, which I would recommend. But if you care about stuff like trophies or your PSN account, there's another solution for you, and you're gonna love this. Blu-ray games. That's right, physical media. It is not affected by the CBOMB, so any game you pull off the shelf, you'll be able to play it from now and into the future where Sony shuts down the servers. I wish I had better news on this front, but if you buy a digital game, assume the risk that you may lose access to it in the future. Not just on the PS3, but just in life itself. Without further interruption, let's celebrate and talk some games. 3D.Game Heroes, released in 2009 by Silicon Studio. These developers were most known for the Bravely Default games on the 3DS. 3D.Game Heroes is a love letter to the classic era of Legend of Zelda, more specifically the top-down ones. The game is presented in a voxel 3D pixel style, and at the time it was quite a novel stylistic choice that set it apart from the other titles on the PS3. You can pick from an amusing variety of pre-made voxel characters, or meticulously design your own. The objective here is to gather magic orbs to gain enough power to take out the evil king that has cast a pixel spell on the kingdom of Dotnia. The game is otherwise light on the story, and that's okay with me. Outside of the aesthetic choices, the big gimmick here is, well, a big sword. If your character has a full apple bar, their sword will grow to a gigantic size to decimate enemies and objects on the field. You can save up your money and increase the length and width of your sword at the blacksmiths, and you will find differently shaped swords as you progress through the game. Although many people might consider this game to be a ripoff, I'm just going to classify it as a tribute to the games that came before it. That's certainly evident in the abundant amount of loading screens, which are nods to classic video games, which you can collect and view in a gallery. Who knew loading could be so much fun? One aspect I feel many reviewers failed to mention is a surprisingly addicting tower defense minigame appropriately titled Block Defense. These were originally DLC levels in the Japanese release, but were included on disc in the English versions. The goal is to set up these auto crossbows and other weaponry to stop waves of enemies from reaching the end of the pathway. If you stand still, your character will incrementally gain experience and level up. You can spend the money you earn upgrading the turrets, or purchase more weapons for the field, or trade crystals with the merchant to unlock perks or new weapons. It gets fairly intense the further you get into the waves, and you rarely have time to strategize in the moment. You're just gonna have to die a few times before you get a grip on how you should lay out the turrets. I sunk hours and hours into block defense mode, and I believe if they had released this as a standalone game, it might have sold better than the main one. Now don't get me wrong, 3D.Game Heroes is well worth playing the regular mode. The simplistic graphics and high contrast color palette will draw you into its charm, and I feel it still holds up well in the modern day. Granted, I do find the copious amounts of bloom effects to be a little hard on the eyes. The music is also a blend of retro square waves incorporated into epic orchestrated loudness to imbue a sense of a grand adventure that the story never quite delivers on, but regardless, there's still a solid core adventure mode to enjoy with wacky characters, dialogue, and references to classic games, and quite a beautiful presentation. There's no other game quite like it on the platform, and it's one I often find myself recommending to people as a standout exclusive. 3D.Game Heroes comes with my highest recommendation. Vibribbon, developed by Nana Ansha and released on the PlayStation 1 in 1999, and later localized and released for the very first time in North America in 2014. It's a bit of a strange story how Vibribbon came to the US PlayStation Store. At E3 2014, Sean Layden gave one of my favorite speeches where he stated the importance of unique games and their place in gaming history. The example he used to make his case was one of the first games he had ever worked on, Vibribbon.
A little earlier, I was delighted to hear Andy give a shout out to one of the most iconic games of our time, Vibribbon. Yeah, give it up for Vibribbon.
This created a stir amongst US gamers, thinking that Layden was hinting that something Vibribbon related would be coming out. Sean had no idea that the game was never localized in North America, apologized to the gamers, and then got to work localizing the game for the first time in the US, where it was released on the PlayStation Store on October 7th of 2014. Technically, the NTSC version of Vibribbon is still a PlayStation 3 exclusive, so I'm gonna treat it as such. Vibribbon is one of the most unique rhythm games ever developed. It's monochromatic, kind of presented in a simple vector style. You play as a little bunny rabbit named Vibri as they march happily along to, well, whatever the track that's playing. Vibri runs along a line, and there's a set of obstacles that populate based on the notes found within the musical track. It's somewhat of a platformer where you press a button to perform a move to clear the obstacle. You really have to run the tutorial a few times to understand which button to press because the game does not spell it out for you. If you want to get good at Vibribbon, you need to develop some muscle memory here. There are a multitude of different tracks to traverse and varying degrees of difficulties, some of which I will never clear, and there's a really unique feature where you can pop in your own favorite music CD and the game will generate a level based upon it. This feature does work on the PlayStation 3. Vibribbon is just one of many games that were never localized in North America, and I wish Sony would still make an effort to localize some of these games that were left in other countries. Oh well, I guess we gotta leave it up to the fans once again. If you like Parappa the Rapper or rhythm games in general, Vibribbon is one of the most unique you'll ever play. Check it out. This is The Eye of Judgment, developed by Japan Studio and released in late 2007. The Eye of Judgment had been in development for some time before it eventually released. It was one of those budgeting AR-centric experiences that initially wows you when you first see it, but it's rather tedious in implementation. I'm not a card game guy, but I did buy this because it came with the PlayStation Eye, a stand for the PlayStation Eye, a silk mat, which acts as the playing field, and a deck of cards produced by Wizards of the Coast. This was an online multiplayer card game where both players had to possess a PlayStation Eye, a set of cards, and the game somewhat models itself after Yu-Gi-Oh!, only a lot less cool in implementation.
Player. Draw card. Mana charge. Mana release. Summon.
The game got lots of booster packs that you had to buy so you could get all the good characters and advantages in battle, and it eventually did get some expansion packs which I've never checked out. Online support for the game was discontinued in September of 2010, so I can only talk about the single player experience. And that experience is kind of lonely and sad because you're just sitting alone in your room, placing cards in front of your PlayStation Eye so you can face off against a CPU that has all the best cards and knows each one of your moves at least 3 steps in advance.
I am defeated.
Out of all the augmented reality games on the system, this is one of the better ones you can play if you like card-based RPGs, and the opening cinematic really oversells the experience, but I can see what they were trying to do. I don't think Sony's ever going to make something like this again, unless it's VR-centric, so if you like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic the Gathering, taper those expectations. The Eye Judgment is a good deal if you can get it with the PlayStation Eye, so you can eventually use it for the PlayStation Move, which is how I'm currently using the Eye. It's not fun to play, but it is worth owning if you're interested in early AR technology.
Mana release. Summon.
It's finally my turn. That'll never happen again.
Attack.
This is Afrika, also known as Hakuna Matata elsewhere. The premise for the game is as basic as it gets. You're a photojournalist dropped in the middle of Africa, and you're given many requests from different people to go out there and photograph all the wild animals. There's limited interactivity with the animals. You just kind of hide out in a bush, whip out your camera, and snap a few photos. I could never get too far into Afrika before I ended up getting bored, but I feel this may be a slow burn kind of game, as you do collect a lot of money that you can spend on upgradable cameras and other gear like that. I'm sure this is one of those 30 hours in, it becomes an awesome game, but I usually don't have the patience for that. This game has been compared to Pokemon Snap. Sure, it's like Pokemon Snap without the color or fun, but if you're into photography and you like nature, I would give it a soft recommendation. This is Infamous, released in late 2009 by Sucker Punch. They're a studio most known for the Sly Cooper series. I'm not typically a fan of open world games or comic book related things in general, and I didn't check out the Infamous series until it was given to me for free by Sony in exchange for all of my personal data that was leaked. A fair exchange if you ask me. Infamous 1, 2, and the expansion pack, Festival of Blood, are still trapped on the PlayStation 3. Infamous stars a character named Cole McGrath, who happens to have cool hobbies like parkour. One day while making a delivery, an explosion happens and Cole inherits electric superpowers. In Infamous, Cole is what you call a conduit, a person that can channel powers, usually tied to some form of element. You're pretty much let loose on a facsimile of New York City called Empire City. From here, it's really up to the player to decide how you want Cole to turn out. It's mostly a binary choice. Either you can have him do evil things by attacking the citizens and making bad choices, which affects his karma, but also unlocks different powers along a bad karma skill tree, or the opposite. The beauty of Infamous is in its simplicity. It's a fairly small scale open world, but a fun one to climb around and traverse. It plays like a third-person shooter, where Cole's electric powers can subdue enemies, fire rockets, hover around like Storm from the X-Men, and everyone's favorite mechanic, Cole can slide around town on electric lines. I think I'm starting to understand why the Sonic fans love the Adventure series now. Since Cole is a conduit for electricity, his big weakness is bodies of water, prohibiting him from swimming around. Primarily, he's a landlocked superhero, but they play into his strengths really well. Cole can absorb more power through various sources of electricity and find a lot of collectibles that go into upgrading his superpowers. The story isn't anything too original, but that doesn't bother me because I have so much fun in doing all the little side objectives and toying around with the destructible environments that still hold up over a decade later on the PlayStation 3. In particular, I love the Louisiana-inspired setting of Infamous 2. At the time, I thought it was quite a unique setting to place a superhero game in the bayou. I mean, at any point I could run into Gambit, right? If you liked Infamous 1, Infamous 2 gives you more of the same, only more of it. Also, if you have an Infamous 1 profile, some of your upgrades and karmic choices will carry over to 2. Story-wise, it really doesn't matter if you were good or bad. 2 kind of picks up as if you're starting from a blank slate no matter what. You can also pivot from evil to good if you want, or vice versa.
Hey, good shot, man! Now get back to the boat. Pier's breaking up.
Nice work, McGrath. That was impressive.
Cole McGrath certainly earned his place as one of the more iconic mascots of the PlayStation 3 era. Both his good and evil forms appear as playable characters within PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, which I found to be an interesting way to handle his inclusion. He's also one of the better fighters in that game, if I'm going to be real with you. I hope this segment doesn't age well, and we see Infamous remastered on current-day platforms. Infamous 1 and 2 are essential titles to have in any PS3 library.
Gotcha.
Hey, man, you climbed all the way up there. Might as well come down with style.
Good. Now, there should be a thumb drive attached to the collar. Plug it into your phone.
Infamous 2 Festival of Blood. Much like Red Dead Redemption Undead Nightmare, Festival of Blood is a standalone game / DLC set in the world of Infamous with a horror theme. Despite there being an Infamous collection that combines all 3 games, Infamous Festival of Blood has never been released on a Blu-ray, as it was given as a voucher code in the collection. Zeke, Cole's best friend, is trying to pick up a saucy lady in the bar by recounting the story about how his best friend, the superhero that's super cool and famous, turned into a vampire that one time. Cole is kidnapped by a brood of vampires, and his conduit blood is used to resurrect the urban legend Bloody Mary.
Yeah, Cole's blood had brought her back all right. In return, she gave him a little something on the side.
This DLC is not canon to Infamous, and it allows you to go completely off the rails in terms of the karmic system. Cole is now a vampire and he has the thirst, so you don't have to feel too bad about draining 100 civilians to get that trophy. The game takes place during a single night where Cole has until sunrise to slay Bloody Mary and reverse his vampirism, and also stop a whole bunch of phosphorus bombs that were planted under the city. The festive New Orleans setting, with all the fireworks and people dressed in costumes, makes for a unique and horrific atmosphere. This is like a Spider-Man meets Buffy the Vampire Slayer guide-in kind of game, and I'm here for it. You can level up Cole by staking a bunch of vampires, using his new vampire senses to find newly turned vampires in the crowd and stake them without any sort of legal consequences, turn into a swarm of bats and fly all around the city, which comes at the expense of your blood meter, so you have to go back and drain more people, and use Cole's set of superhero powers on top of it. I wish more games would take the Undead Nightmare approach and just go completely batshit and break all the rules established by the base game, only to then wipe the slate clean canonically after it's all said and done. Festival of Blood will only run you about 3 hours to 100% completion. If you just stick to the story, there's absolutely no fat in this experience. It's a steak-and good time that's trapped in the coffin of the PlayStation 3. If you're a fan of the Infamous series or just want to get a taste of what the game is like, sink your teeth into this one. This is a game that I feel needs no introduction. Demon's Souls, brought to you by From Software, the original 2009 release that Sony passed on publishing in North America because they feared it was too hard for our gaijin brains. Thankfully, Atlas picked it up for publishing in North America, and the game was a massive success, and Sony ate crow in the end. One of the most unique factors of Demon's Souls, besides its difficulty, was its online multiplayer. You could leave funny or useful messages for other players. There was a co-op system known as the Blue Phantoms. There was a PvP component, and one of the most interesting features is the bloodstain system, where you could touch a bloodstain and see how another player on that server died, so it could help you be more cautious within your gameplay. Because of the game's popularity, the official servers ran up until February of 2018, and I presume following the development of the Blue Point remake, they decided to shut them down, likely in favor of pushing players to buy the new PS5 version, and thus rendering the PS3 version obsolete. That was until fans of the original Demon's Souls came together and created a fan server for the game that everyone can access without modifying your PS3. It's really easy to do, and I'm gonna show you how. On the cross media bar, go over to network settings and go down to internet connection settings. Click custom. Choose wired or wireless depending on what you have. Choose auto detect, automatic for your IP configuration. Do not set for DHCP, and here's the most important step. You're going to set a custom DNS connection. Click manual. Then on primary DNS, enter the following address: 142.93.245.186. You can leave the secondary DNS alone. Then all you gotta do is keep tapping right until you end up at this screen. You'll do a quick internet connection test, and if everything says success, then you're good to go. It blew my mind finding out it was possible for fans to create custom servers for you to play in. If you want more information about the status of the fan server, or if you're interested in supporting it, I'll leave a link to a good resource down below. Sony doesn't want you to know this, but like most all the games on the PS3, it does not require a PlayStation Plus account to play. The PS3 is one of the last free consoles that allows for free online matchmaking, and God knows how long that's going to last. Either way, the game's really cheap and easy to find, and even if you already have the remake, I still recommend going back and trying out the original. It still holds up. Folklore, released in 2007 by Yoshiki Okamoto's Game Republic. Folklore is half parts a mystery game and the other half an action-style Pokemon adventure. You play as one of two characters, either Ellen or Keats. The game takes place in a small Irish town called Doolin, where a woman was murdered many years ago. They are both trying to get to the bottom of this murder, and in doing so, they come across the town's secret, its connection to the world of fairies. Throughout the interaction with the fairy realm, both Keats and Ellen have to fight their way through a series of monsters called folks. They have the ability to capture the folks' souls during combat, and the more souls they absorb, the more powerful they become. This is one of the few games that requires a 6-axis controller, as it never received a later patch. I really love the art style and atmosphere of Folklore, and as I was playing it for this video, I just wanted to keep playing it. It's a fairly long game with 2-player campaigns to go through if you want the true ending. It might be a hard game to track down because it did not get a digital release. It's quite sought after, so if you come across a copy, you better get it while you can. And if this game looks interesting to you, then check out my video on the subject. This is Darkstalkers Resurrection, which also did appear on the Xbox 360. Darkstalkers is essentially a supernatural/horror fighting game where you take beautifully animated monsters and pit them up against each other. It's like a Halloween version of Street Fighter. Darkstalkers Resurrection stood as a test for this franchise, as Capcom was going to measure its success in determining whether or not they would develop a new entry in this franchise. Although it was a top seller on the digital marketplace, it still wasn't commercially successful enough for Capcom to continue on this franchise. The game is cheap, the servers are still active, and it's free to play online. I fully recommend it. Amy, released in 2012 by Vector Cell. Amy was a digital-only exclusive for the 7th generation of consoles. Now, the survival horror genre is my favorite, and I figured for the low price of $3, I decided to check it out. Now, I was warned to stay away from this one, so I went in with the lowest possible expectations. And early into Amy, those low expectations were met and then lowered even further. Amy takes the framework of everyone's least favorite part of a video game, the escort mission, and then designs the entire game around that one part you dread. In the game, you play as Lana, a caretaker of a young girl named Amy, whom has undisclosed special powers. The train they're riding on derails, and all hell breaks loose thereafter. Some sort of zombie virus has spread across the city, and it's up to Lana to escort Amy to safety, whilst battling rage zombies and performance issues. The screen tearing here is horrendous, which confounds me considering there's never any major action or game taxing elements that would warrant this. The combat is absurdly frustrating. Your hits never feel like they have any impact on the tide of battle, and it's a guessing game for how many whacks it takes to knock out an enemy. Now, I can understand making enemies feel like an unsurmountable threat to encourage stealth mechanics in a game, but there are times when you're forced to engage in the combat, so that concept's thrown out the window. Through the magical power of autism, Amy is stereotypically a super hacker that can break into mainframes to bypass locked doors. She can also ward off the zombie virus through holding hands with infected people, and then she casts some magical runic spells that are supposed to aid in the stealth mechanics, but they are a pain to cast. You can issue all sorts of verbal commands to get Amy to either hide or flip a switch, but there's generally not much of a purpose to doing this because most of the time you can scout ahead as Lana, clear out the room of enemies, and then go back for Amy. The game was deservedly panned by critics upon release. At the time of the game's launch, it had virtually no checkpoints, which would set players back to the beginning of the level. The devs did eventually release a patch to add more checkpoints, but did little to address the myriad of technical issues and gameplay balance. To date, Amy has never been released on physical media or PC. It's fortunately trapped on the 7th generation of consoles, and I'm okay if it's buried there. Only check this out if you're looking for frustrating games with no redeemable value.
There's everywhere! Scrap, lady! There's everywhere! Scrap, lady! You and no door is smart enough to beat Cello in his magic trick. After use, ladies.
Ape Escape, released in 2011 by Sony themselves. This is sadly the final entry in the long-running franchise. Now, on its face, Ape Escape seems like the perfect match to utilize the gimmicks of the PlayStation Move Wand. Ape Escape has always been a gadget-centric series, and this entry is no different in that regard. Primarily, you use a slingshot to get the ape's attention, and then switch over to a giant net to capture the ape. Rinse, repeat across a handful of levels. The experience feels like an in-house tech demo for the PlayStation Move Wand that was later beefed up and turned into a product for sale. The graphics are what you've come to expect from the series, simple polygons and bright colors. Nothing about this presentation wowed me, but I did find the anime cutscenes, which serve as a paper-thin storyline, to be entertaining enough. For Baby's first rail shooter, it's a serviceable enough experience, but it's scraping the bottom of the barrel of monkeys as far as the rest of the series is concerned. I think if this were released as a pack-in game with the PlayStation Move Wand, it might have found more of an audience, but to the world at large, it remains an often forgotten about failure, and a weird note for the series to go out on. But if you are interested in picking this up, this is a digital exclusive in North America, but it did get released on disc in Japan and PAL territories. You decide if it's worth the import costs. I just downloaded the demo and I felt like I played the entire game. Battle Princess of Arcadias, released in 2013 by Apollo Soft. This was published by NIS in America as a digital-only exclusive to the PlayStation Store, but it did get a physical release in Japan. I've had this one in my backlog for some time, and it turned out to be a surprisingly decent little side-scrolling action game in the vein of something like Dragon's Crown or Odin's Sphere. You play as Princess Plume, who is building an army of heroes to stop a legion of monsters from invading her kingdom. As the story progresses, you recruit new characters that you can switch to or have them assist you in battle. The way this is handled is similar to Marvel vs. Capcom, with tri-attacks and other characters popping in and out to deliver little blows. The presentation is a bit on the cutesy side, and it's quite raunchy in the dialogue, but it fits in well with the rest of the NIS library on the PS3. The general structure of the game has you taking on missions to slay monsters, collect materials and money, and then take it all back to town to craft stronger weapons and armor. What sets Arcadias apart are its war missions, where you gather sets of troops to take out a rival kingdom or a large boss. There's sort of a rock, paper, scissors delegation of troops at play here, where you have to issue commands and switch out the troops in response to the flow of battle. There's a slight learning curve to these encounters, and they can be quite challenging if you've been neglecting leveling up your soldiers, but it's still a unique enough system to break up the monotonous beat-em-up bits. Although this game isn't on par with the beautiful presentation of a Vanillaware title, Battle Princess of Arcadias holds its own enough to give it a chance if you're looking for something different in the 2D action RPG genre. It feels and plays like a budget title, so go in with those expectations. I thought it was pretty cute. Check it out. Blood Drive, released by Sid in 2010. This is a title that commenters have been recommending for me to check out for years now, likely because of my love of a little game called Zombie Virus. Blood Drive belongs to a genre of games that I lovingly refer to as white trash kidcore, and it's inspired by the godfather of this genre, Twisted Metal. There's a destruction derby tournament centered around two main objectives: vehicular combat and the eradication of hordes of zombies. You choose from one of 8 zany yet mostly forgettable characters and are given various objectives to complete before the timer runs out. These objectives boil down to destroying other vehicles, using weapons you find on the map, or using said weapons to wipe out as many zombies as possible.
Run off! Wrong weight class!
I levy the same criticisms against Blood Drive that I do with Twisted Metal 2012. They both tried to cram in too many half-baked modes instead of refining the main draw to the games, the vehicular combat, and in this case, zombie killing. The attention here should have been paid into the zombie killing to set it apart from Twisted Metal. Focus on making one really entertaining mode, and the rest of the ones that you tack on later could be easily forgiven. The game just feels out of balance in this regard, since you're stuck with a character during tournament mode that has a stock set of attributes which may give you an edge in one mode, but then put you at a major disadvantage in another. The game suffers most from the lack of identity, shrouded in the brown and gray cloak of mid-aughts level design, where the color palette was as limited as the fresh ideas apparently. From reports I've read, the online component has been dead since launch, and I can understand why. Only pick this up if you're looking for games that were left on the 7th generation of consoles that's not likely to get a port to anything else. Soft recommendation if you like the Twisted Metal series.
Rival kill! Off the paint job! Sweet! Asses off!
Twisted Metal, released in 2012 by Eat Sleep Play and directed by a clickbait goblin YouTuber. This is the second reboot of the Twisted Metal franchise, the first being Twisted Metal Black, which is one of my all-time favorite PlayStation 2 games, so I went into this project with rather high expectations. All physical copies came with an online pass, meaning if you bought it secondhand, you would have to buy a separate online pass. Problem is, the servers for the online mode went down in early 2019, meaning you can no longer play the multiplayer component unless you play locally, which the game is capable of landing up to 16 PlayStation 3s or 4 PlayStation 3s with 4 players at each station for a grand total of 16 simultaneous players locally. So you can technically still play the multiplayer, just not in a convenient fashion. Okay, so let's talk some positives. There is an interesting story mode where they take a more serious tone to the Twisted Metal lore, and they present the background of each of the playable characters, notably Sweet Tooth, and how they got involved with Calypso's competition. This is presented in a B-movie think grindhouse fashion, and I think it captures the correct tone for the Twisted Metal franchise, just on the border between horror and comedy.
Oh, I know who you are. I know who you really are.
Who am I? What am I?
They truly did try to open up the arenas and scale of Twisted Metal, for better and worse. My personal preference leans towards kind of a smaller arena with destruction derby elements and odd weapons, but for the most part, short and to the point. And the problem with a lot of these destruction-focused games is that they try to be overly ambitious, introducing things like capture the territory in an icy New York City streets, and then go to the next zone, otherwise you'll take damage and die. It's really not fun to just have to rush through all these ice physics and split your attention against all the competitors in this destruction derby competition. Some of these maps and the matches just go on for far too long, depending on what sort of situation you find yourself in. For example, there's this level where a semi-truck rolls around the city, constantly spitting out new competitors that enter the competition if you don't take it down quick enough. There are some absolutely miserable time attack races that they've added into the game with twisty turns and no guardrails, so you'll end up flying off and have to restart the entire mission again, or maybe you didn't make it to first place and somebody else detonated the bomb and you have to keep running Diablo Pass over and over again. That's where my enjoyment of Twisted Metal started to wane. To the game's credit, when you play through the single player campaign, you're not stuck with the same vehicle with the same stats. You can change it up by swapping out the vehicle and the different weapons, all of which have different stats to suit the need. This is a good compromise and prevents the game from feeling stale. I can't necessarily call Twisted Metal a dead franchise per se, as it is living on as a kinda bad sitcom now, but if they're gonna take another crack at this franchise in game form, stick to the basics. Go back to black. Partial recommendation. Drakengard 3, aka Dragoon 3, co-developed by Access Games and Kavia. To date, this marks the only collaboration between Yoko Taro, the creator of Nier, and Swery65, the creator of Deadly Premonition, although I don't think he had much of an influence on the game as he only acted as a producer. The Drakengard series models itself loosely around the Dynasty Warrior, aka the Musou franchises, only they're elevated by the dark and morbid story written by Yoko Taro. They also have a loose timeline that's connected to the Nier franchise, due to the multiple endings you can unlock. Personally, I didn't care much for the first two Drakengard games, but there was something about 3 that captured my interest. Drakengard 3 was one of those late-in-life PS3 games where they changed up the banner to have some parity with the PlayStation 4 box design. I always thought this was kinda cool. Drakengard 3 is a prequel to the entire Drakengard series. It's so somewhat of a good place to start. You play as the foul-mouthed Zero, who's on a mission to kill all of her numbered sisters. 1 through 5, I believe. I must admit, the game has a stellar opening. It's a high-flying, blood-soaked hack-and-slash adventure that has some real character to it, to say the least. The combat system is quite fluid, and it provides you with a variety of upgradable weapons that all have different looks and combo systems, much like the original. Not only do you get to play as Zero, but you do get an oddball companion dragon named Mikhail, who has one of the most interesting introductions.
How many times have I told you? Don't roll around in the fucking mud!
Drakengard appealed to me most through its little moments, like when Zero is just roaming around her house reminiscing about events past, or when Zero has campfire chats with Mikhail. The dialogue is raunchy and dark, not too dissimilar from what you would find in Nier, and I was really starting to get into the game, but there are so many technical problems with Drakengard 3 that it gave me a headache from an hour of playing. Outside of the massive amount of screen tearing, the frame rate is so wildly inconsistent that it drops down to single frames at times, notably during the dragon flying segments. With the popularity of the Nier series, I'm honestly shocked that the Drakengard series hasn't gotten an HD collection on modern hardware. I would recommend Drakengard 3, but not necessarily on the PlayStation 3 itself.
Damn it, no! Stand strong!
Out of my way!
Don't let her through! No time for cowardice! Stand tall and fight!
Trash Panic, developed by Japan Studios and released exclusively on the PlayStation Network in 2009. Trash Panic was one of those titles that fell under the radar for me. It's an odd Tetris clone meets a physics simulator, and it's kind of hard to describe. Essentially, you have a conveyor belt full of trash, and you have to fit it into this oversized garbage can without letting any of the pieces of the garbage fall outside the can. It's a little strange in the presentation since you're given a cross-section of the garbage can. You just don't want it to fall out of the top of the garbage can, if that makes sense. Essentially, you're given a bunch of trash with different properties. Some are heavy objects that can be used to smash down the lighter objects within. Other objects have properties like fire, which can be used to incinerate all the garbage within the can, allowing for you to make more room. There are also pieces of garbage that you actually have to protect from getting smashed down, so one of these little guys can come and retrieve it for bonus points. Typically, I love these kind of puzzle games, but for whatever reason, I just couldn't wrap my mind around Trash Panic. It always felt like the game was throwing garbage that I couldn't compact, and then it starts speeding up the conveyor belt, so you're just tossing as much crap as you can into that can, but then it starts overflowing rather quickly. I didn't love it, I didn't hate it, I'm somewhere in between on this one. I think if I go back and give it another try and watch a few high-level players on YouTube and how they handle things, maybe I might end up enjoying it. This is certainly not going to be ported to anything else. It remains an exclusive to the PlayStation 3, and if you want to play one of those forgotten exclusives, then give Trash Panic a try. Boku no Natsuyasumi 3, aka My Summer Vacation 3, released in 2010 by Millennium Kitchen. This is a Japanese exclusive that is begging for a translation. It was released on Blu-ray, and thankfully all PS3s are region-free, so anyone can check this out. I absolutely adore this series. The best way I can describe them is that the Boku games are a slice of summer life in Japan simulators. You play as a little boy, Boku, as his family goes on on holiday in a simple farm town. Now, there is a language barrier in place, but the spirit of childhood adventure can be universally appreciated, and it's still somewhat playable despite the barrier. As Boku, you spend your summer days running around catching bugs in your net, making friends with other kids in town, fishing off of almost any pier, or going out for a dive. Graphically, the 3D models haven't evolved much in the franchise, but it's not necessary to get the point across. It's supposed to look like a children's book. The world is comprised of beautifully painted backdrops, which dither into darker shades of blue when the night falls. Most of the game is just running around helping out people in town, and just experiencing the unstructured joy of children's play. There's been a big resurgence in interest in this franchise, partially due to the release of the Shin-Chan Summer Vacation game that was released in English, and there's also a translation project for Boku 2 by Hilltop. Since this game is aimed primarily at children, the language used is simple and a good place to start if you're just learning Japanese. If you're looking for something neat to import, check out Boku 3.
では、いただきます。
いただきます。
ごちそうさまでした。
ごちそうさまでした。
Toro to Morimori, aka Toro Let's Party, co-developed by Japan Studio and Beckside and released in 2009. Toro is a mascot for Sony. He's kind of known as the Sony cat. And believe it or not, Toro has over 15 games, but only a couple of them were ever localized outside of Japan. Most of you might recognize Toro from his inclusion in PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. They're a bit of an oddball character, to say the least. Surprisingly enough, Toro Let's Party got an English release, but only in the regions of Hong Kong and South Korea. So if you want to play this game that was fully translated into English, you gotta import it from Asia, or in my case, pirate it. This game was released in celebration of the 10th anniversary of Toro, and the best way I can describe it is that it's a compilation of over 30 party games, mostly geared towards children. Oddly enough, there is a story mode to this minigame compilation. Toro has a wish of becoming human, and he gets a diary and is told that he can have his wish granted if he fills that diary with thank yous from the other cast of characters he meets along his journey to become human. Sure, makes sense to me. It's one of those do a bunch of favors for an oddball cast of characters and maybe something cool will happen at the end. Spoiler, it doesn't. As mentioned before, the game is a series of quick minigames, some of which involve the 6-axis motion control, like when you become a server and you have to yank the tablecloth off the table without damaging all the dishes, or when Toro becomes an understudy for an ogre in a festival play / living target for people to pelt baseballs at him. I'm sure there's some historical significance behind this scene. By the way, if you want to know where he got his moveset in PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, look no further. I'm not quite sure why Toro wasn't pushed harder in the West, because he is a cute mascot cat, and the character is quite significant to the legacy of PlayStation and all, but maybe the higher-ups at Sony didn't see any value in these simple kind of games. Personally, I prefer simple games like this, and I would have definitely purchased it if I was given the option to. A neat little bonus is that the game disc included these custom Toro themes. I always liked it when Blu-ray discs included neat little extras like this. Toro Let's Party isn't the best of the import bunch, but it is a cute little game that should provide at least a couple of hours of entertainment. Check it out if you're curious about the character. Linger in Shadows, released in 2008 by Plastic Studios. This is a digital-only art experiment, interactive art. It's one of those things that appeared in my library, and I'm not exactly sure how it got there. Linger in Shadows has no story and very minimal gameplay. Essentially, you're controlling a movie, and at various parts within this movie, you pause the scene, and you can interact with some of the 3D models, which causes some sort of time distortion and unlocks more of the movie for you to watch. The game is entirely reliant upon the 6-axis, so you're gonna need one of those compatible controllers in order to actually beat the game. /interactive movie /demo. I know Linger in the Shadows may come off as pretentious to a lot of you out there, but I kinda like these ambitious tech demos that were released early into the PlayStation's life that were never really elaborated upon in a full game. It was just like, hey, I got these bizarre ideas, let's put them out there into the world and just see what happens. But it's kind of fun in its own right. Like if you remember DVD menus, trying to find all like the hidden secrets within a DVD, that's what Linger in the Shadows feels like, and there aren't too many video games about that very niche interest, so I'm gonna recommend it on that basis. If you enjoy DVD menu secrets, then Linger in the Shadows is worth picking up. I don't feel like this is ever gonna get a port anytime soon. Check it out. Datura, also put out by Plastic Studios in 2012. This is a digital-only PS3 exclusive. Like everything from the studio, it's an experimental art showcase with minimal gameplay. You can play this with a Dualshock 3, but the game was designed with the PlayStation Move in mind, so that's how I played it. This is what we call a hand simulator, where you enter some sort of wooded purgatory to rub all the trees and ask nature for guidance or some shit. I know most people will walk into this simulator thinking this is another pretentious indie game that lacks substance or fun, but Datura is so disjointed and strange that I kinda enjoyed it. It's mostly a bare bones VR experience, a sans headset that places you in a variety of unconnected vignettes. One minute you're driving through a desolate highway, and the next you're hacking away at an icy lake with an axe. Mind you, there is a coherent wraparound story that takes place in the real world, but it's as basic as they come and very predictable. Now, I wouldn't recommend Datura for most players. It's a bit on the short side and easy to 100% if you're a trophy collector, but there will be moments where you'll say, hey, that was kinda neat, and you might resign yourself to its atmosphere, maybe. If you're looking for games that will be trapped on the PlayStation 3 forever, this is surely one of them. This is Lair, released in 2007 by the now deceased Factor 5. Oh, this title was extremely hyped up near the launch of the PlayStation 3. Almost every demo kiosk in any video game store you went to had this playing in the background to show off that cool PS3 motion controller tech. On its face, Lair seems like a cool enough concept. You're a dragon rider in a Muso-style giant army war simulator kind of thing. I mean, look at all the character models on screen. How can you not be impressed by this?
That's it, Burners. Push their army back.
Sometimes you're on the ground doing ground combat against a rival kingdom, where you never really feel like you have any sort of influence over the tide of battle. You mostly just swoop around on your dragon, launching fireballs and praying that you can trigger the next flag to progress the game forward. You're never quite sure what you should be aiming at in the moment. I just tend to target other dragon riders, and then occasionally you engage in a QuickTime event which relies on the 6-axis motion control. Notoriously, this game was panned by critics because the flying used to be solely controlled by the motion controls, which is to say, not at all. The game did eventually get a post-release patch to allow for analog control, but that doesn't fix the myriad of issues with Lair. In particular, I did not care for this escort mission where you have to take this swarm of giant manta rays across the ocean for some reason, and then oh no, there's a giant Hydra boss that you have to perform 3 3 QTEs to defeat. The game is as bland as they come design-wise. It's brown and gray and sharp alias jaggies everywhere. I think it's one of the worst showcases of the PlayStation 3, and it's partially responsible for killing Factor 5. So on that basis alone, I hope it's trapped on the PlayStation 3 forever so it can do no further damage. Eat Them, released in 2010 by Fluffy Logic. Once again, this is a PlayStation Store exclusive title, and I hadn't heard of it until I started making this video. Eat Them is largely inspired by the Rampage franchise, where you take a big kaiju and put it in a destructible arena. Eat Them is sort of a monster garage, where you get various unlockable parts to genetically modify a monster into some horrid abomination with mismatched colors and odd appendages. If you're a kid, there's certainly a lot of appeal to this concept. The goal of the game is as simple as they come. Take big monster, destroy city, the military, and sometimes other big monsters. The destruction physics aren't the most sophisticated on the PlayStation 3, but they do a decent enough job, I guess. It has a bit of a wacky wraparound story and a variety of missions to change up the otherwise repetitive gameplay. It has the same appeal as Rampage does. It starts out really fun and wacky, and then by level 50, doing the same thing over and over again, it wears thin, and then you just don't want to play Rampage for about a decade. And then you're like, hey, remember Rampage? Let's try it out. And then you get bored again. That's Eat Them. It's a digital-only PlayStation 3 exclusive, and it will never get ported to anything else. Check it out if you're into that kind of thing. This is Rain, released in 2013 and co-developed by Acquire and Japan Studio. Unfortunately, Rain is a digital-only title in North America. However, there does exist an Asia English physical release that is absurdly expensive under the name Lost in Rain. This is an art house 3D platformer that takes place in a city that's inspired by Paris, where you play as a nameless boy whose soul somewhat gets detached from his physical body, and the boy can only be seen in a silhouette that's revealed by rain. It's a very straightforward action platformer with an emphasis on stealth. There are these monsters that also lurk around the desolate streets that will attack the boy if he reveals himself via the rain. However, you can hide yourself from the various monsters that roam the street by getting under awnings that cover yourself from the rain. This is an incredibly beautiful and mesmerizing platformer that kept my interest all the way through. The game is laid out in chapters, which are told with these beautiful watercolor stills. This is a game with a real artist touch to it, and indicative of the creativity at play within Japan Studios, RIP. It's not a long game, but if you want the full story, you're gonna have to beat it a couple of times to collect all the hidden secrets within. It can be frustrating in a few spots, but the game provides unlimited continues, so it's never too frustrating when death happens. The concept is simple and effective, and it's probably going to be trapped on the PlayStation 3 forever. If you want one of the platform's most unique exclusives, look no further than Rain. This is Pain, released by Idle Minds in 2007. Released as a digital exclusive, but it later got printed to a Blu-ray in Europe in 2009. Believe it or not, Pain predated games like Angry Birds, where it was all about taking an object and throwing it into a destructible environment for points. You take a character, sometimes a licensed one, depending on if you bought any of the DLC. You put them in a big slingshot, and you launch them at destructible things on the map. Much like Crash Mode in Burnout, your goal is to create as much havoc and destruction as you can from launching your character. While you're midair, you can somewhat alter the character's direction by moving one of their limbs. The controls are a bit wonky, takes some getting used to, but it's not terrible at the job it's trying to do. This is one of those early physics-focused games that didn't truly capture the power of the cell processor, but that wasn't entirely the point. There have been many better ragdoll physics games that have come out since Pain, but sometimes it's nice to take a nostalgic look back at how primitive and crass games used to be. Try and import the physical copy rather than giving Sony money.
Oh, I know you're enjoying my TNA. Talent and ability.
ICO HD, or more accurately referred to as ICO HD, released in 2011 by Bluepoint Games. This is an HD remaster of the PlayStation 2 classic that I used to hate, but after playing Bluepoint's HD remaster, I grew a new appreciation for it once I understood how the mechanics worked. You play as a boy with horns who's trapped in this abandoned castle. Along the way, he meets a mysterious girl named Yorda, who's trapped in this cage at the top of the tower. Upon releasing her, the duo are attacked by these shadowy creatures. You make your way through this desolate castle, pushing blocks, activating switches, riding trams, and staving off the shadow creatures before they kidnap Yorda, and it's game over. I made a whole retrospective on ICO that goes into my opinions further, but I will leave you with this. If you're interested at all in speedrunning, ICO is a good place to start. It gives you all the fundamentals of platforming. There are some neat skips that anyone can learn, and the game also emphasizes the speedrunning component by giving you a trophy if you beat it under a certain amount of time. Out of the two games in this collection, I find ICO to be less buggy and more true to the original game feel than Shadow of the Colossus HD, which I will elaborate upon shortly. If you've played The Last Guardian or Shadow of the Colossus, seriously, give ICO a shot. There's a lot of clever design behind this escort mission, and it's been unfairly judged over the years. This version of the game is still exclusive to the PlayStation 3, and it's among the best exclusives you can find on the platform. This is Shadow of the Colossus HD, also released by Bluepoint in 2011. I'm going to admit my bias up front. The original Shadow of the Colossus is one of my favorite games, so if I come off like I'm being nitpicky here, I assure you, this is the worst version of Shadow of the Colossus you can play. The story of Shadow of the Colossus centers around Wander, a young man who travels out to a forbidden land to seek the help of a god known as Dorman to resurrect his beloved. Wander makes a pact with Dorman, defeat the colossi that roam the land, and Dorman will grant his wish. I can say that the desolate open landscape of the Forbidden Lands is still intact. It is an upscaled version of the PS2 original and resembles the original artist intent. Another unique aspect exclusive to the PS3 version is its inclusion of the stereoscopic 3D for use with 3D televisions, or in my case, the PlayStation 3D TV. Out of the two games in the HD collection, the 3D mode here had more time and consideration put into its development. The 3D adds a unique layer of immersion that you won't find in any other version. The problems with Shadow of the Colossus HD rear their ugly head the moment you engage with the Colossi. At first I thought I was misremembering how the platforming was in the original game, but something is completely off about how the grip physics work when Wander is scaling the Colossi. I thought I was going crazy, but I didn't remember Wander just constantly swinging around on these Colossi and having noticeably shorter windows to stab the Colossi in the weak points. From what I've heard, it has something to do with the increase in frame rate. This game runs at a mostly stable 30 frames, which somehow affected the animation cycles of the Colossi, causing them to shake Wander a bit more frequently. It leaves a terrible first impression if this is your entry point into the franchise. The messed up physics are especially noticeable if you want to take on the time trials, which unlocks all the different hidden items and trophies if you're into that sort of thing. The third Colossi is nearly impossible. You just have to get lucky and hope you can land a strike before they shake you off. I am still going to recommend this collection because you can beat the game since you have an unlimited time to do so in the single player campaign, but it's not going to be as enjoyable as the original or the remake on the PS4. But if all you care about is the exploration bit, collecting fruit, or hunting lizards, then you can still have some enjoyment here. Partial recommendation at best. Noby Boy, put out in 2009 by Namco. This was a passion project by Keita Takahashi, the creator of Katamari Damacy. Namco wanted to milk that franchise, but Takahashi had other ideas. This is a very difficult concept to explain, but I'm gonna do my best. Noby Boy is some sort of stretchy worm guy, and your goal is to swallow various 3D objects on whatever planet you're currently occupying, and then use both analog sticks to stretch yourself around the various things on the field until you get tired of playing. And you and the collective amount of players then donate the amount of meters you've stretched yourself to feed hearts to Noby Girl, which is a galactic entity that's only purpose is to stretch itself around all the planets in our solar system and eventually around the sun. As you would check in the game, like once or twice a year, you might unlock a new level after enough players have stretched themselves to unlock the new planets. Only the mad mind of Keita Takahashi could conceptualize something like this. It was still ongoing after he had long left the studio. Like PlayStation Home, it was one of those experiences where you kinda had to be there to fully understand it. And 5 years after Noby Boy released, the experiment had concluded when all the collective players jelked their way to the sun. This is a digital-only title. It will probably never happen again, but if you like Keita Takahashi's other games like Katamari or Watam, it's worth a few bucks just for the novelty of it. Journey, released in 2012 by That Game Company. Journey takes a lot of inspiration from Shadow of the Colossus, but more emphasis is placed directly on the atmosphere, less on things like combat. You play as a cloaked figure in a desert, and aren't really given an objective in a formal manner. As the cloaked figure, you kinda just wander around and explore this desolate ruins, without any sort of story explicitly stated for you, more of an implication of things that happened in the past, told through a series of flashbacks and slideshows. Your primary goal is just to figure out how to get up to that mountain. Your character is very limited in terms of movement early on. They have a magic scarf that allows them to float for a short period of time, which you can then extend by finding these various glowing symbols across each one of the maps. The more symbols you find, the higher you can jump and glide, which aids in the exploration. I know this sounds kinda corny, but I could just sit down and play this game over and over and never get bored of this premise. There's something captivating by having a game not full of distractions and side objectives, just a very simple amount of collectibles, minimal storytelling, and just a beautiful ocean of sand and rays of sunlight just reflecting off of each one of the individual grains. The cloaked figure also has the ability to revive other pieces of fabric within the world, which allows them to float and recharge their scarf. Since we're talking about a decade-old title at this point, I know the major gimmick has already been spoiled for the lot of you, so I'm just going to go ahead and say there is a subtle multiplayer component to the game, something that can only be understood your first time playing. You run into other cloaked figures and you might have the impression that you're dealing with an NPC because you don't have any active forms of communication like voice chat or text. You can only communicate with the other cloaked figure by only making tonal sounds with your cloaked figure. Or you can just play the game start to finish and never run into another person. I'm a sucker for gimmicks like this. If you like games heavy on the desolate atmosphere and subtle lore that you can pick apart in your headcanon, then I would absolutely recommend Journey and the Journey collection itself to kind of trace the evolution of that game company's works. Journey is their magnum opus and one of the crowning indie games released on the PlayStation 3, and it's perfect no matter where you play it. This is Flow, also a part of the Journey collection. Flow was a very early experimental indie game that was released on the PlayStation Network. Flow is a game about a cellular creature in a survival of the fittest, eat the smaller thing until you get bigger, Darwin kind of game. It's one of those games where you just put on a good set of headphones, listen to the ambiance, and enjoy the somewhat arcade-style, simple gameplay. You eat a bunch of creatures, and then go to the next layer and eat bigger creatures, which will have somewhat of an influence on how your cellular creature evolves. You can unlock a bunch of different creatures as the game progresses, and there's really no end state for Flow. Just play as long as you want or as little as you want. Fun fact, you can run into one of the Flow creatures inside of Journey in this little sand tower here. I'm not sure if this is canon within the story, but there are a lot of different That Game Company nods within Journey if you look hard enough. For some people, Flow is a great art showcase of the PlayStation 3, and others it's just a simple time waster. I had some fun with it, check it out. This is Flower, released in 2009, also by That Game Company, and it is also part of the Journey collection. This was my first time playing Flower, and it's not so much a game that you play, but an art showcase that you experience. But that's okay with me. It's a gorgeous game where you play as a flower petal, and your goal is to find other flowers and gather more petals until you're a big windswept mesh of flower petals that goes around healing the earth in an Okami-like fashion, bringing color back to the vegetation around you. This game also heavily relies on the 6-axis motion control that takes a little bit of getting used to, since there's no UI elements to guide the direction of the wind that you're controlling. Are you controlling the pedal or are you controlling the wind? But once again, this is meant to be an experimental art showcase, more of a demo scene art house project rather than a fully fledged game. The flower in Flower also appears in Journey as a desert flower, and therefore canon to Journey. It's a very short game, and I'm using that term loosely, with not a ton of depth, but it's a nice little experiment that won't take too much of your time. Check it out. This is Heavenly Sword, put out by Ninja Theory in 2007. Heavenly Sword was a flagship title for the PlayStation 3. It was touted as one of the must-have exclusives for this platform, and to this very date, it still remains one. Often overshadowed by God of War, Heavenly Sword was one of the earlier cinematic hack-and-slash brawlers that pushed the platform to its limits. In Heavenly Sword, you play as Narako, a warrior who gives her life to protect her kingdom against the evil king Bohan, played by Andy Serkis. This is kind of one of those deal with the devil scenarios where Narako gives up her life in exchange for the power of the Heavenly Sword. You can see how the story is going to be telegraphed very early on, and it takes a lot of cues from the Lord of the Rings and Kung Fu action movies.
To celebrate the capture of the Heavenly Sword, I invite you all to indulge me in my little distraction.
The Lord of the Rings influence is no coincidence here, with the inclusion of the aforementioned Andy Serkis and Peter Jackson's company Weta FX, who used their facial capture technology to render out the performances in the cinematics. Over the years, I've wavered back and forth on my opinions of Heavenly Sword. Back in the day, I thought it was one of the most amazing looking games I had ever played, and I was willing to overlook some of the more rougher aspects of the presentation. In the current day, I'm able to let my recency bias subside, and I'm somewhat critical of the opening act of Heavenly Sword. I think it has one of the weakest openings of any game I've played, primarily due to the first act being so inconsistent. Instead of starting the game with the Heavenly Sword and learning all the different stances, you're given just kind of a stock weapon and thrown into a button-mashing hell where you don't get to feel for the fluidness of the combo system that's saved until the next chapter. Right after the mash-a-thon, you switch to another character, Kai, this cat girl, who has a crossbow, and it becomes a shooting gallery segment where you can barely see all the soldiers coming to rush the gates, and you gotta snipe them all over the field. The game initially forced you to use 6-axis motion controls to enter the bullet time where you can slightly guide the arrow towards the enemy. Thankfully, you can toggle off the 6-axis and enable joystick control, because otherwise, the game would be entirely ruined by this. The shooting gallery segments almost ruined the entire game for me, but if you keep practicing, they're not terrible. For example, I kind of like the cannonball big war segments where you have to take out these catapults that are storming the castle. They are far from perfect in terms of control, but I got used to them after I realized that lining up the top of the cannonball with the target seems to be the most accurate way to aim the projectiles. The slow motion aiming becomes less practical when all the soldiers start rushing the field, so you end up in blind fire mode where you're just spamming as many cannonballs as possible. For an early PS3 game, the big war segments are quite impressive with the amount of characters on the screen, and it doesn't come at the expense of too much performance. But if I could go back and change something about this game, I would remove all the bullet time based projectile scenes. It gets a little ridiculous later on where you have to ricochet hats, and it's not something you'll understand until you try it out for yourself. The first chapter of the game is a little rough around the edges, but if you make it to the second chapter, the game really picks up in both cinematic flair and gorgeous vistas that really did showcase the power of the PS3 in the context of 2007. The core of the game is centered around the combat. Narako will be placed in an arena with about 10 or so enemies where she has to dodge and counter her attackers and switch between a few fighting stances, somewhat like the Arkham Asylum games. The enemies will telegraph their attacks denoted by these colors, and then you have to switch to the stance resembling that color so you can perform a counter attack. By today's standards, it's a little clunky, but once you get into the flow of battle, it'll become second nature, and you'll start to enjoy all the finishing moves that were inspired by Kung Fu movies. Some of these are quite brutal. Ninja Theory had plans to turn Heavenly Sword into a trilogy, but as they were working on the sequel, they decided to stop and prioritize work on Enslaved: Odyssey to the West. Sony was in talks of outsourcing a new developer to take over the franchise, but that never materialized. They didn't entirely forget about Heavenly Sword, as Narako is a featured character within PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, and she retains a lot of her moveset from the game. 7 years after Heavenly Sword was released, they also put out a CG movie based off of Heavenly Sword. as you all may already know, Ninja Theory is now owned by Microsoft, which puts this series into the dead franchise category. It's a shame that Heavenly Sword has never been remastered on a more modern console. I'd like to see Sony give this franchise one more crack, or at least a remaster, but I won't hold my breath. Although flawed and emblematic of the overproduced cinematic action games that Sony would later become most known for, I still have a soft spot for Heavenly Sword, and I recommend everyone give it at least one chance.
I've been watching you, Nariko. You fight with style. Hello, style.
Experience.
This is Puppeteer. It's one of Sony's most neglected franchises. This game was developed by Japan Studio and directed by Gavin Moore, who also directed the Demon Souls remake and was an animator on the Siren series. To call Puppeteer just a 2D animated platformer would be selling the game short, as it was developed with 3D in mind to be used on the PlayStation TV. Also, it incorporates the PlayStation Move, but you don't need either of those to enjoy this game. In the game, you play as Toro, a boy turned into a wooden puppet who possesses some magical golden shears that he uses on his quest to stop the evil Moon Bear King, who has taken over the Earth's moon. There's a lot more going on in the plot, those are just the broad strokes. The platforming was built around the golden shears, and all the objects you can cut through. In Super Mario Bros. 3 fashion, the stages are a literal stage. The story unfolds like a play, and the set pieces are quickly changed when you transition throughout the level. You also have a magical floating partner that you control with the analog stick, which helps Kutaro interact with the background elements in order to find the level's secrets. This partner can also be controlled by a second player in a co-op fashion. Kutaro also has the ability to swap out his head. Throughout the game, you find multiple different heads that you can wear, and this gives the game a Metroidvania-like quality, as you may have to revisit levels with the heads you collect and use the head's special ability, which will often lead you to a secret area. The only issue I can see with this game is it might have been hard to market. On the surface, Puppeteer presents itself as a cute game aimed at children, but don't let looks deceive you. Puppeteer can be quite the technical and hardcore platformer as the game progresses. Unfortunately, Puppeteer never caught on, and that's likely due to it releasing so late into the PlayStation 3's life cycle. It came out in September of 2013, just 2 months shy of the launch of the PlayStation 4, which likely overshadowed this great game. 8 years later, we still haven't heard anything from this franchise, so it's safe to assume that it's stuck on the PlayStation 3 forever.
Unlike wild carp, which are a sort of greyish brown, the koi is a domesticated variety prized for its panoply of colours. Right now, Kutaro is hitching a ride on a Yamabuki Gold. But I'm personally much fonder of the tri-coloured Sankei. Something about those sublimely balanced splotches of red and black upon that fishy white canvas. Oh, it sends me into raptures.
Fat Princess, put out in 2009 by Titan Studios. This was also a part of the Best of PlayStation Network Volume 1, so you can get it on disc. Fat Princess was one of those unofficial/official mascots that Sony tried to make work in the mid-aughts, but never really caught on for reasons unknown. For example, the character Fat Princess was included in PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. There are two kingdoms at war, denoted by the colors red or blue. You don't play as Fat Princess herself, but instead one of her loyal subjects. That's sort of a blank slate. From the get-go, you get to pick what kind of class you want to be. Do you want to be an archer, a marksman, a builder, or something along those lines? All you gotta do is pick up a hat and go to work. There are a lot of different objectives here, but the main one is to go over to the rival kingdom, kidnap their princess, and bring them all the way back to your kingdom. However, the rival kingdom is also trying to kidnap your princess. But in order to slow down their progress, you can pick up pieces of cake on the field and fatten up your princess. Think of it as a game of capture the flag in poor taste, and I love it. You can also do things like capture various checkpoints throughout the map, which will unlock shortcuts for you. You can also do things like collect resources, just have a guy out there chopping wood or mining for ore, which you can bring back to your base to unlock new weapons or classes to use. use. You have a bit more of an active role as one of the subjects, as you can use things like charge attacks or magic and slay enemy soldiers and deplete them of their resources. You want to go after the outposts so you can grow your army and unlock shortcuts and take possession of more of the map so you can siege their gates and capture their princess. Playing Fat Princess in the current year, it still holds up. The graphical cell shading style lends a timeless quality to the game, as well as the over-the-top violence and dismemberment presented in a fairy-tale children's story manner. It's deceptively cute on the surface, but it's actually quite a hardcore, competitive multiplayer game. Now, I believe it is still possible to play this online, but in the current year, you're not going to find too many people still playing the game. It still has a very robust single-player mode with interesting maps, and there is a DLC campaign which I haven't checked out, but the maps do provide a lot of variety in your strategy. For example, this volcano level where lava constantly rises and falls, unlocking different parts of the map. Some of these campaigns will last over 30 minutes, and you won't even notice the time flying by. Fat Princess had about 3 different games before the series was quietly shelved by Sony, the most recent one being a PS4 title that almost nobody talks about. This is one of the best pick up and play games on the PS3. Fat Princess comes with my highest recommendation.
We have captured an outpost.
This is PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. PlayStation All-Stars, more like PlayStation's intellectual property graveyard Battle Royale. This game's biggest problem is its lack of identity. It's always going to be compared to Super Smash Bros. But that's what they were hoping for. They just wanted to create something that would look cool playing 24/7 on a GameStop kiosk, and they didn't sweat details like balance, technique, or soul. I will lend this game some credit. I thought the mashup levels were rather interesting. The levels sort of evolve from one franchise to another during the course of the battle. While they're cool looking, they're ultimately distracting to the fight itself, as you're constantly looking at these wild animations in the background or trying to dodge environmental hazards. The game also has a rather boxed-in feeling because there's no penalties for falling off the stage. Most of the stages are just closed off so you can't fall off of them, and there's nothing preventing you from visiting the far extremes of the stage in the middle of battle. The way the developers handled this problem was by zooming out the camera really far so you can get a full look at the whole stage. This would often make me feel lost in the battle instead of focusing on where the action was happening. The servers for this game have been long dead, and I'm not aware of any fans trying to resurrect it. It was a shame because I quite enjoyed playing this online back in the day on my PlayStation Vita. The team behind the game were working on bringing more characters to the roster, but the game wasn't as successful as Sony had hoped, and they halted production on additional characters. Believe it or not, Dart from Legend of Dragoon was already rendered. I describe this game like I describe most of Sony's failed attempts to capitalize on an already existing Nintendo idea. It felt half-assed and then quickly abandoned thereafter. This "we couldn't be bothered" feeling just permeates throughout the entire experience, and it leaks into the story mode. The story mode is just a glorified set of still frames with some narration thrown on top of it. There's no overarching plot or sense of victory that comes from beating the game. You beat this really obscure PlayStation demo disc boss, and then the game fizzles out.
You've been practicing. Victory! How could this happen? None have beaten me until now.
I wouldn't call this a terrible game by any means, but it depresses me every time I play it. Like, if Sony had actually cared about their legacy at all, not only would we have an amazing Smash Bros. Rival on our hands, but perhaps it could have brought some of these franchises back to life. I recommend this game because it's cheap and we'll probably never see anything like this again coming from Sony. I mean, can you think of any current mascots that they still have that would be equivalent to a Nintendo character to feature in another Smash Brothers style game? You gonna put Knack in? Astrobot? I don't know.
There's a storm coming in, and it's good to know who your friends are.
I said I'm here alone. I'm not your friend.
Well, that's too bad.
This is Tokyo Jungle, and it's my absolute favorite PlayStation 3 game. Published by Japan Studio and developed by Crispies, Tokyo Jungle takes place in an era where mankind is extinct and the wildlife roam the city streets. The tagline for Tokyo Jungle is survival of the fittest. You get to choose one of 80 different types of animals, either a carnivore or an herbivore. If you're a carnivore, you roam the streets looking for other stray animals, you sneak up on them, kill them, and then eat their corpse for their delicious calories. Beneath the silly exterior, Tokyo Jungle is an incredibly complex RPG. The time is always ticking in Tokyo, and your animal is growing hungrier and older by the minute. You have to be constantly on the move, looking for food. And the more you eat, the more your animal levels up. And the more it levels up, it can attract a higher quality mate. You can then breed your animal to produce a new generation. The next generation has higher quality stats, and each member of that animal pack acts as an extra life, as well as a gang member. The environment is constantly changing. Sometimes an area you occupy will have abundant food, or no food at all. There's a lot of animals to fight, cool equipment to attach to your animal. Look at this, I put Badman on this kangaroo's back. Did I also mention the game includes a robust story mode, and it's kind of disturbing and not half bad? Tokyo Jungle is also one of the few games for the PlayStation 3 that was later patched to include a remote play feature, which allowed you to play it on your PlayStation Vita. Somehow, this game did get a physical copy in North America, only it's tucked away in a collection called The Best of PlayStation Network Volume 1, which should actually be called Volume Only because this is where it ended. Tokyo Jungle is indicative of everything Hikikomori Media stands for in a video game. I love it with all my heart. It is the best of the best. Highest recommendation. Short piece, Ranko Tsukigime's Longest Day. Say that 5 times fast. I've talked about this game before on my channel, but it does bear repeating. It's another interesting experiment brought to you by Suda51.
Hello, I'm Suda51.
Ranko Tsukigime's Longest Day acts as the 5th entry in a multimedia project known as Short Piece. In a nutshell, it's 4 short anime films and 1 video game all coming together to form this bizarre anthology of creative works. In North America, this anthology was released as a digital-only exclusive to the PlayStation Store. It does contain all the short films and Ranko Tsukigime's Longest Day. Once further, there is an English physical version, but it was only released in Europe. The game was written by Suda and developed by Crispies, the creators of Tokyo Jungle. As a matter of fact, the Pomeranian from Tokyo Jungle is a stage boss in this game. The basic goal is to get to the end of the level as fast as possible, getting as many combos as you can, and finding secret routes and presents along the way. The game is super short, about 10 levels long, but that was by design. This is one of those games where you just replay levels over and over for mastery, trying to get better times and bigger scores. There's some interesting boss fights and Suda-isms that you've come to expect from his games. It contains assassins, motorcycles, and Mexican wrestling. He really went out of his comfort zone for this one. Also put out by Game Republic, this is Toy Home, a digital exclusive download game where you play as a wind-up car set in a completely destructible environment where you must race around the map trying to collect all the rainbow rings and coins and crash into things, earning a lot of points so you can unlock other wind-up cars. It has that beautiful sense of scale that you would find in games like Chibi Robo or Pikmin. The gameplay and premise are on the simpler side. What makes it unique, however, is the entire game was designed around the 6-axis motion control, where you tilt the Dualshock 3 to move your car left or right. You also shake it if you crash in order to reset your vehicle. I find this to be a great game to test out your Dualshock 3 to see if it's capable of motion control. There also used to exist an online multiplayer component, but good luck trying to find somebody else with a copy of this game to play it with. Since Game Republic is no more, and Sony's likely going to shut down the PlayStation 3's online store, you better pick it up now before it's gone forever. If you like stupid games with easy premises, Toy Home's for you. This is Siren Blood Curse, released in 2008 by Silent Hill and Gravity Rush creator Kiichiro Toyama. This is a full-on remake of the original Forbidden Siren game, which I'm not a big fan of. Thankfully, they went back to the drawing board and made so many great improvements that I'm willing to state that Siren Blood Curse is one of the best survival horror games that you can get on the PlayStation 3. The game takes place in 2007 in a remote mountain village in Japan, and you follow a whole host of different characters. You're constantly jumping between storylines and protagonists. It's a tried and true third-person survival horror brought to you by one of the godfathers of the genre. Your characters encounter the game's primary enemy, known as Shibidos, aka corpse people. They're essentially zombies that can use tools. The unique feature to the Siren series is known as sight jacking, the ability to jack the sight of your enemies and see where their positions are on the field. You get to look from their perspective. It also takes up the split framing technique that was later used in the medium, although here you have the option of turning it off when it's too distracting. This horror game pulls no punches. It gets graphic and disturbing rather quickly, and hopping between characters and different scenarios, it makes the pacing very fast, and as a result, it never feels stale. My only complaint here, once again, lies on the shoulders of Sony, as they had no faith in the game's Western success, so they omitted a physical release. This, once again, is a digital-only title in North North America. However, there does exist a Japanese and PAL copy. If you can get your hands on one, I fully recommend it. This is one of the best horror games on the PS3, and this franchise is as dead as it gets. Toyama has left Sony, and unfortunately, this is going to be stuck on the PS3 forever. This is Yakuza Dead Souls. It was and still is an exclusive to the PlayStation 3, and I wouldn't mind if it stayed that way. I've been harsh on this game in the past, but it is my least favorite Yakuza entry. In retrospect, this was more of a harmless spin-off, but at the time of its release, it was a critical and commercial failure. And it was one of the main reasons that Yakuza fans cited for us not getting Yakuza 5 in the West, instead it being delayed 3 years on its worldwide release and only being a digital copy on the PlayStation Network. Until it was eventually remastered on the PlayStation 4. Although I do have to give Sega credit, in the Yakuza Remastered collection, they did include an empty PlayStation 3 box for the North American release of Yakuza 5. Even though there was no PS3 Blu-ray included in it, I'll just put my Japanese copy in there. But I digress. This is Yakuza Dead Souls. Kamurocho is under attack by a zombie virus, and it's up to our Yakuza boys to figure out what's going on. The Japan Ground Self-Defense Force has set up a quarantine zone within the city. The boys have to go in, shoot a bunch of zombies, and rescue survivors, and then unlock different parts of the city. That's about it. I just think third-person shooting mechanics are antithetical to the whole Yakuza experience. But if you're dead set on playing every Yakuza entry, this isn't terrible, it's just as standard as they come. And in some places unoriginal. There are special infected that roam the city, and a lot of them mirror those found within Left 4 Dead, and if you've played that game, they'll be quite blatant. Everything you've come to expect in Yakuza still shows up. Funny mini-games, odd sub-stories, tons and tons of challenges, and a greater emphasis on the humorous side. I've warmed up to this game over the years now that I know that it didn't kill the franchise in the West. If you're into the Yakuza series, then give it a shot and tell me what you think.
Go, go, go!
The last guy.
This is The Last Guy, another classic brought to you by Japan Studio. Unfortunately for the West, it is a digital-only title. However, there is a physical Asia English version that contains English subtitles, but you'll have to import it. The premise of The Last Guy is quite simple. You are the aforementioned last guy, and you must save the citizens from the zombies that will munch their brains. You do this by walking by buildings and other structures where people are hiding. They'll then join your party. Your goal is to gather as many people as possible and take them back to the safety zone without touching any of the zombies or monsters that occupy the map. You get more points for building a longer line and dropping it off at the safety zone. The game becomes a wonderful game of Snake where you try and bob and weave your giant line of people through the city without touching the zombies. This game has a fantastic sense of humor and a unique sense of challenge. Oddly enough, enough, this game reminded me of a minigame you could find within Work Time Fun, where you gather all these protesters together, and wouldn't you know it, both games share the same director, the infamous actor slash synth pop musician slash video game director Pierre Taki. In 2019, Pierre was arrested for suspicion of cocaine use. At the time, he was working on the video game Judgment, but his arrest caused the game to halt production, and all of his lines had to be redubbed. In court, he did admit to the cocaine use, but I felt if they would have just looked at Work Time Fun for the PSP, that would have been enough evidence in the court of Hachiko. He guilty as fuck. I fully recommend both Work Time Fun and The Last Guy. Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots released around 1 year after the North American launch of the PlayStation 3. It was many gamers' reason for purchasing the system, as well as the reason to keep it after all these years. As to this very date, it still remains a PlayStation 3 exclusive. As it stands, the PlayStation 3 is the only official way to play all the mainline Metal Gear games on one platform. And yes, that does include the 2 Metal Gears for the MSX, which were included in the Legacy Collection, and that includes Metal Gear Solid for the PlayStation 1, as all PlayStation 3s are backwards compatible with PlayStation 1 games natively. Set in the distant future of 2014, war has changed, and so has our leading man, Solid Snake, and his time is running out. It's not often that you're placed in the role of a geriatric protagonist dropped into the middle of a battlefield with a muscular exoskeleton that's also equipped with an active camouflage unit. As a matter of fact, I think this may be the only example of that.
Metal Gear.
I don't think this game gets enough credit for its sound design. Playing the game in Dolby surround sound, it truly makes you feel like you're in an active battlefield, with soldiers yelling out commands, explosions overhead, and bullets whizzing by. It's a far cry from the silent infiltration that you might have been used to in the previous games. Many have noted over the years that Metal Gear 4 is a lot more cutscene heavy than previous entries. And that's a true statement. You can go on YouTube and type in Metal Gear Solid 4 all cutscenes, and these compilations can go on for about 9 full hours. But even if you have no idea what's going on in the story, you can always just skip the cutscenes and play around in the stealth-based sandbox. Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots is an essential title to have in any PlayStation 3 collection.
What's going on?
The PS3 began its life with a Metal Gear, and pretty much ended its life with one too. Now I know what you're thinking, Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain is not a PS3 exclusive. No, it's not, but I still feel it's worth pointing out because the game came out nearly 10 years after the launch of the PlayStation 3. And gosh darn it, it's kind of impressive. By all accounts, this is the worst way to play Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain. It runs at an uncapped frame rate and maintains around 20 frames per second, rarely if ever reaching 30. It's aliased and super sharp and has the draw distance of a nearsighted child. Hey Venom, try not to cut yourself on your beard. This low ass frame rate is making all the cutscenes a tad more cinematic, and I think that's how Kojima envisioned this game in his head. Therefore, this is the definitive version. I'm sure there was a discussion had, like, should we just turn everything down to the lowest possible settings, burn it to a Blu-ray, and sell this for money? And Konami said yes. Low fidelity Gear Solid 5 is my new obsession, and I'm not even joking when I'm saying this, but I kind of want to see the entire game running on the PS3 for the novelty factor. It's super cheap and easy to find. If you got a PS3 and you want to see it stressed to its absolute limits, then please pick this up.
You get him? We shook him off. Fire!
I'm Commander Hikiko, and this is my favorite PlayStation on all of the Citadel. Thanks for watching, everyone. You hung out there, applaud you. Thanks to all the patrons for supporting this channel. You got it early and ad-free. And to everyone else, super chats, memberships, all that's appreciated. And if you just want to leave a thumb or a comment, criticism, a suggestion for another system video, I used a lot of the feedback from the last PS3 video to make this one better. So hope you all enjoyed it. I got a whole bunch of playlists around. Sub if you want. See y'all later.